I was working with a team recently, and we were all going to be at home working online, and we were trying to really prioritize face-to-face communication. So I wanted to come up with a way to help highlight that we were going to prioritize face-to-face communication, encourage people to turn their video on as part of the way that we were communicating. So I thought it'd be great to get some t-shirts printed or some type of shirt printed that we could give everybody that would help highlight that's what we were trying to do. The organization I was working with, though, had some stipulations as far as how much you could spend per person because of ethics concerns and stuff. After looking at a lot of the different options, I decided this would be the perfect excuse, or maybe I should say the perfect opportunity, to try doing something that I had been very interested in since high school, which was screen printing. So I was looking, and screen printing equipment was not as expensive as I was thinking it would be, and for the shirts we were doing, I could actually get the press and the shirts and print things for not that much more than what it would cost me to just have the shirts printed, and then I could use it for other things in the future if I decided I liked that. So I set about trying to order all the parts that I needed. So first we found a very inexpensive press on Amazon. We also got a design done and had that burned on the screen by Anthem Screen Printing and had them send us the screen. So one of the first things we noticed is the press did not come with any instructions. There were no instructions with it other than a video of somebody assembling something that looked very similar to what we were trying to put together. But by watching the video and kind of just figuring things out, we were able to get it put together in what I think is reasonably close to what it was expected to do. So we got the press all put together, and there were lots of little hang-ups where we put the wrong part in first and then had to pull it out and put a different part in, and figuring out how things fit together. It was not IKEA-level instructions of how to do things, definitely. But by watching the video and then coming back and forth, we were able to get something that seemed to resemble what they had in the video. One of the biggest things we discovered is that when it's holding the screen, it has some wiggle room back and forth. And later on, we discovered why that's actually important. So after assembling it, we had our heat gun that we were planning on using to dry the shirts. And in looking at a few videos of people online showing how to dry it with a heat gun, the general consensus was that was a bad idea. So we put off our printing a little bit longer in order to get a flash dryer. The flash dryer would let us dry the entire design at the same time, and from everything we could find, that looked like it would be a much safer way to deal with printing. So we assembled the flash dryer, which had somewhat instructions that we could kind of follow, and it went together pretty well. It was a little bit beat up. Oddly enough, the outside of the package looked okay, so it must have been beat up before it was actually packaged and shipped, but it didn't seem to affect the way it worked. So it must have been beat up before it was actually put in the package that was shipped to us, but it still produced heat that seemed to work the way we needed it. This particular flash dryer has the ability to sense when something's in front of it because it's made for a system where the shirts are actually rotating around. So we had to kind of make sure we understood how that works so it didn't kick on when we weren't expecting it. So when it came time to print, one of the most important things we discovered is start on shirts that you don't care what happens to them. We got about 3 t-shirts that were just old t-shirts and just started printing away on every part of the shirt we could find. One of the first things we had to do was get the ink stirred really well. Now this was pretty challenging because it was very, very cold and we were heating the garage the best we could, but it still was very cold. In retrospect, we probably should have used some thinner to make it not quite as thick, but this was our first time, so we're learning as we go. This was the ink we used. It's Plastisol Rapid Cure ink, and it's just white. The Rapid Cure means it doesn't have to get so hot. So there's actually the temperature on it. It cures at 270 degrees. We want to make sure we had the highest chance of actually getting it fully cured. The flash adhesive was another important thing that we had. The flash adhesive is used to keep the shirt on the platen to make sure it doesn't shift around any. So it sticks right to the platen and your shirt, you spray it on the platen and your shirt sticks to that. This turned out to be more important than we realized. I thought it would be a big deal if you were printing multiple colors, but it turns out things do shift around a lot, particularly if you are trying to move the screen or trying to look at what you've done. So we'd spray some of that on and then place the shirt on it. We had a bunch of test shirts that we started with, and these were just old t-shirts that we had either gotten at conferences or were starting to wear out, things around the house. And we found we could print quite a few times on each one by printing on it and then flashing it and then turning it inside out, printing on the other side and then flashing it, turning it in the other way, and by kind of shifting it around. One thing we did discover is that if you print on one side and then flip it over on the other side, that adds some bumps to it. It's not as smooth, so that wasn't the best way to really gauge how it would look on a shirt. It worked fine for what we were doing because we were just really trying to, at first, we were trying to make sure we could get the ink through the screen and know how to do it evenly. So after going through 2 or 3 shirts, lots of prints on them. I think we probably printed 9 to 12 different things to see how it looked. Then we were ready to try with our first hooded sweatshirt that we were working on. One thing we did discover is the hooded sweatshirts, being thicker, are quite a bit different in the way that it prints on from a shirt. So it took a lot more ink on the hooded sweatshirts to actually get it looking right. This is where we ran into some problems. We had stirred the ink best we could, but it was still pretty cold. And when we say ink, plastisol ink is not like you imagine ink. Think of it more of like putty. Starting out with about the consistency of even silly putty, very, very thick. So we stirred it down, and then you put it on with like a spoon or something in fairly large globs, and use the squeegee to push it through the screen. Since it's so thick, it can be hard to get it really even. In retrospect, this is where we probably should have used some thinner in it, particularly with as cold as it was. And next time we try to do a batch, we're going to get some thinner and try to mix it up better to try to get it through the screen more evenly. Now, our design actually had some distressed look to the letters, and most of those, by the time we got enough ink on it that we actually showed up everywhere, most of that distressed look kind of went away, and we ended up with pretty thick ink on it, which worked fine for what we were needing, but it's something that we'll try to improve on in the future. We printed our first hooded sweatshirt, and it wasn't really as even as we wanted. It wasn't bad for the first one, but the letters didn't have the same amount of ink on them. So after that, we started using the squeegee and going over multiple times. And I think in some cases, we were even doing 5 or 6 times back and forth, which is a lot more than you should have to do for screen printing, which is probably caused by the ink being too thick. At least that's our current hypothesis. When we try it again, we'll discover more and let you know if we learned something else. On earlier shirts, after squeegeeing a few times, we pulled up the screen and discovered it wasn't thick enough. So we put the screen back down and squeegeed some more to push more ink onto it. This is where we noticed that the alignment of our screen was not always the same. It's not perfectly registered. This is where we noticed that those loose tolerances we mentioned earlier really came into play. Because when we pulled the screen back down, it didn't end up in exactly the same place, and we ended up with the letters offset just a little bit. When we did that, it picked up some of the ink that was there before, and the next shirt we tried to print on had a ghosting effect, which almost looked like a cool 3D effect, but it wasn't what we were wanting to have happen. So we finally got it cleaned out. We got more shirts that we were fine with throwing away with and printed them to try to figure out how to make it even, and after a number of them, it cleaned off that extra ink that was stuck to the bottom. After we discovered that, we made sure that we only lowered the screen one time onto the shirt. Now, from watching other people that are doing screen printing, they seem to be able to lift it up, look at what's going on, put it back down, and print again. I think this is because of the quality of the press. Since ours has just a little bit of give back and forth, it's not perfectly aligned when you bring it back down again. And there may be some adjustments we can make to the press to try to make that more precise. So we finally ended up with a process that looks something like this. We would make sure that there was flash adhesive on it, and it was usually good for like 2 to 3 shirts before we had to apply it again. We would put a shirt on the platen, we would pull the screen down, pull the squeegee across it, and we had to do it 6 or 7 times, I think, usually, of back and forth, moving the ink through. It ended up with ink that was really, really thick, but if we didn't do it that many times, we ended up with unevenness. Like I said, I think that would probably be solved if we were to have thinned the ink to where it would pass through better, or maybe even if it just wasn't as cold. So when we'd move the flash dryer over the shirt and turn it on, we wanted to make sure that we got it to 350 degrees for 30 to 60 seconds was what we were targeting. Now, the plastisol ink that we have is rapid cure, and it cures at 270. However, we needed it to cure all the way through. It couldn't just be the temperature on the outside of the ink. And unlike steaks that you can actually stick a thermometer in the middle of it, we didn't have a way to actually measure what the temperature was inside the ink, so we were aiming high. We did use this, which laser thermometer lets us point at some of the ink and make sure we know exactly what the temperature is at that particular point. So we'd kind of move it around on both sides and make sure that we got them both sides of it to 350 degrees for, like I said, 30 to 60 seconds. This seemed to work pretty well, and it came out well cured, and at least so far has remained on the shirts. We did discover that the flash dryer wasn't necessarily super even in the way it heated. We kind of adjusted it a little bit to try to get the temperature even over the entire area that we were printing as best we could. We also found that by turning it on and off, we could keep the temperature at the 350 degrees without getting it so hot that we would catch the shirts on fire. But also makes this video a lot less interesting than it would have been had we actually burned something. In the end, we ended up with some, what I consider to be pretty nice shirts for our first attempt as company swag, encouraging people to get their video on and prioritize face-to-face communication. I can print more of these, and I've got kids to help me do it as well. So the nice thing about printing these is I can make more of them if I need to for pretty much just the cost of the shirt and maybe some help from my kids in getting them printed. In retrospect, things that I probably should have done differently is I probably should have gotten a slightly better press that is more aligned, or taken the time to make sure that this one didn't have any play back and forth before I tried printing with it. Another thing I should have done differently is we should have gone ahead and gotten some thinner and mixed with the ink to make it to where it wasn't quite as thick going on. Those two things would have allowed us to print evenly with probably less thickness in the ink that we were applying. Now, one of the interesting things about plastisol ink is it doesn't dry unless it's cured. Water-based inks actually will dry. Plastisol ink doesn't dry unless you cure it, which is where the curing process becomes so important, because no matter how long you just leave it on your shirt, it's not going to dry until it gets hot. This was convenient because we were able to start on some shirts one night and then come back to it the next day and finish our batch. All in all, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. My team now has some nice sweatshirts to wear to remind us to prioritize face-to-face communications. My kids and I got a lot of experience doing something that I've wanted to do since high school. And I have the setup to make more of these shirts whenever we want to.